Good afternoon. At least it's afternoon while I'm sitting here and recording this. I have no idea when you'll be viewing it. So, one little business thing first. Because there was some confusion about exactly what we were supposed to do, I reopened the Dropbox for the first video submission. So if you have not gotten it in, it would be a good thing to do now while you're doing this. This is our second video. And in here, I'm actually going to take off from some of your answers to the first video questions. Specifically, we talked about how you would interact with a person in the community-based health environment and what you could do there. Now, several of you suggested that to respond to the needs of a particular client, handing them some sort of pamphlet would work. Here's the reason I want to take off on that particular point. We have a lot of pamphlets that have been developed over time. If you've worked in public health, you may be aware of all the different resources that are out there. The USDA has tons of resources, Extension Service has tons of resources, almost every university, especially the major state universities, have tons of resources of various pamphlets or handouts. Even larger city public health services will very often develop their own material. What I have noticed over time is that, at least more often than should happen, these particular materials, with the best intentions, don't get me wrong, they're the best intentions, are not sufficiently tested with the target audience. Now, one of my own students and I did a research project where we ran into this phenomenon. We were looking at educational knowledge and nutrition education for parents with babies that were had documented levels that were high, 15 parts per million. No, it's not 15 parts per million. Whatever it was significantly above the cutoff for which we would say, okay, they got too much lead in there. One of the nutrition solutions, other than trying not to have them chew on lead paint, but one of them or play in a lead tailings pile, one of the nutrition solutions is to increase calcium consumption, because calcium causes the body to excrete lead. It competes with lead in the gut to prevent lead from being absorbed. So along with a lot of other therapies, and don't get me wrong, I'm not minimizing the other therapies, but along with the other therapies, making sure they have adequate calcium, making sure that they have ways of getting that calcium in is an important component to this. And what we found was the materials that we examined at that time very often were wordier than they needed to be. The people in the area we were in St. Louis, the people who were living in the older houses that had not been remediated, had not had the lead pulled out, were very often poor and of low literacy level. And so a nice, long, involved 3-paragraph explanation of why this is good for your kid very often was much less effective than it should have been. When we reviewed several, this wasn't the exact purpose of her study, but it ended up being one of the side effects that I thought was excellent. When we reviewed the materials and we used several different brochures, we would ask them which they liked. They liked the ones with pictures and recipes. They were willing to accept our word that calcium was good. A lot of them were lactose intolerant, and so we were trying to steer away from have a big glass of milk. We were trying to steer more toward cheeses and yogurts and ways to incorporate things like that, or looking at some of the calcium-rich vegetables. But they were much more taken with simple recipes, with pictures so they could see what it was supposed to look like, with fairly easy directions. They're not looking for recipes that require exotic spicing, that require fancy pieces of equipment to make a particular little shape. They want basic and simple. And we didn't find much like that. In fact, one of the best parts to me of this young lady's master's thesis was at the end, she took a chunk out of her results and discussion and said the ideal brochure would incorporate these points that we found were good and all the others. The other side of this, and this is going beyond just you've got to have the brochures aimed at your clientele, aimed at their level of knowledge and their level of nutritional knowledge. The other side of it is a pamphlet by itself is not going to be effective. There needs to be an interaction between the healthcare professional and the client, and it's got to be a continuing interaction. It can't be, welcome to my clinic, here's a piece of paper, life will be good if you just follow everything I put on there. Now, having said that, I know darn well that you're going to have trouble getting people to come back. This particular experiment I was telling you about, the lady, we picked randomly, we picked a day of the week where she could fit into her work schedule, and she spent the entire day in this clinic. And one of the things that she was blown away with, and I was kind of shocked by too, was they were averaging 80% no-shows. Now stop and think about this. This is parents whose children are diagnosed. They have been told by a medical professional, your kid has lead poisoning, we can help you, but you have to show up. 80% no-shows. And they were counting anybody who came in that day as showing up, even if their appointment was the day before or the next day. Understanding the vagrancies of the work situation for these people, I understand why they were doing that. But when they're not showing up, when they're not responding to your needs, to your input, you have a significant problem. This is why the brochure has to be as good as possible. Because although the brochure by itself is not optimal, a brochure by itself is less than top, it may be your only interaction with them. And you're not going to know when you give it to them whether they're going to come back to you. I'm going to briefly review stages of change. I know you're all familiar with this, but I'm going to briefly review it. You have the pre-contemplation. What do you mean I need to quit eating so much salt? You have contemplation. I wonder why they're telling me I need to eat much less salt. Preparation. Well, you know, I could probably tolerate this if I took off the salt and added more garlic, or hot sauce, or onions, or garlic salt, or onion salt, or whatever they're going to do, so they really don't have to get rid of the salt. And then the action component. They actually make the change. And then the maintenance component, which is where they incorporate the new pattern into their life and that. You should plan on, if you don't have time to test people, and that's not always optimal, you should plan on they're coming in pre-contemplation stage. You're not going to move them to action in one meeting. This is why it's so important to get more meetings. And it's so important that you at least schedule more meetings. Now, you can run into things like this. Well, a couple of my students and I were doing a research project at the VA in Houston. And we were working with people who were significantly overweight, BMIs of 35 and above. And we're in a cardiac clinic at the VA. So they've got a pattern of showing up at outpatient clinics, okay? They show up for their cardio visits once a month. We brought them in after the cardiac clinic. They came to us. We did a lesson for them, and we would schedule, since the cardiac appointments, depending on the patient, were a month to 2 months apart. We were trying to get them to come back every week. We had 25 people in the first class. We had 4 people show up for the second class. We had 1 person show up for the third class. So that young gentleman got a grilling. What's going on? Well, some of it was obvious. How do we get in touch with you to remind you of your appointment? Call this convenience store because I'm living in my pickup truck and I stop there for coffee every morning. Think you're going to have trouble getting the appointment word to them? But the more telling one was the gentleman that was in the clinic that came back the third time was probably about 5'8", and he weighed somewhere over 280 pounds. And he lived in a pretty nasty neighborhood. And we said, do you understand what we're trying to tell you? And he said, yeah. In fact, his children were bugging him. You need to lose weight, Dad. We want you around for a while, Dad. You're already going to see the heart clinic. All right, what is your reason for hesitating? And he said, in the neighborhood I live in, if I lose weight, the dudes will hassle me. Being large made him less susceptible to being mugged. Do you see the education problem there? Do you see what you have to try and do in a community setting to assist these people in realizing what the health changes? Facetiously, I told the student, tell him if he loses the weight, he'll be able to run faster. Which obviously is only facetious. But this is the problem you have in community nutrition. You do not have control. You have at most the ability to convince them that what you have means something. You have the ability to convince them that you can work with them and help them. This is not easy. A colleague of mine in St. Louis was attempting to set up a WIC center in an area of St. Louis suburbs that was underserved. And it happened to be predominantly African American. And they were getting nothing from the community. Nobody was interacting, nobody was interested in talking with them, etc. Until my very bright friend went to talk to the pastor of the largest church in that vicinity. And he looked at them and said, how do we know you are here to help us? Show us that you really care about our neighborhood. And so for 4 weeks, she and her husband attended this church on Sundays, sat there, participated in the service. And on the 4th week, the pastor said, I want to introduce 2 friends of ours that are here to help us. They're going to set up a WIC clinic for you young moms and your kids. And after that, they had no problem with their clinic. Okay? So getting through to the people you're trying to reach is difficult and takes time. Now, what I want you to do for the project for this lecture is I want you to design a pamphlet for me. Having just said pamphlets are a way to interact, and I want you to use as much clip art as you can from around the internet. Obviously, don't use stuff that's copyrighted. Use only stuff that is freely available. And I want you to focus on, you're dealing with a young woman or father. Actually, one of the more interesting responses we got in that lead study was from a young father who was a single father and was very concerned about his kid and felt very uncomfortable about his ability to do this. I want you to design a brochure for them, dealing with the interaction between calcium and lead, and also some of the facts about lead poisoning. Okay? Your book discusses it very briefly, not very adequately. You can find any number of references online, so I'll let you find one of those. Make sure you tell me what the references are. I want a pamphlet. It could be 1 page. You could even envision that it's a threefold, okay? I don't care how you set it up, but I want a pamphlet I can give these people so that they can hopefully be interested in coming back and listen to me talk to them about what's going on. All right? By the time I get this posted, you should have a Dropbox for this. And as I said, no more than a page or two. References would be nice to tell me where you got your information. And enjoy.